This video is the second part in our three-part exploration into dialogue. Last week we discussed why dialogue is so important, exactly how much dialogue should be in your story, and the basic necessities for formatting dialogue. This week we look at one of the most celebrated books on writing, Dialogue by Robert McKee. This book focuses on three major things: function and types of dialogue, how to fix your broken dialogue and turn it into something that moves your characters and plot, and how to write unique dialogue for each of your characters. Doing these writing book breakdowns is one of my favorite kinds of videos. I read through these books and I highlight all the important takeaways and I add my own experiences and knowledge, and I give you something that's like the Spark Notes version of the book. This video will never replace the book, so I highly recommend that you pick up your own copy using the link below. In doing so, you can support this channel at no extra cost to you. The third video in this dialogue series is a community Q&A where you can post your questions below or in our super awesome Discord. Join if you haven't already, because that place is popping with awesome and supportive writers who want to help you grow. And I'll collect all the most frequently asked questions and answer them. No BS, no answers that just say it depends. I will give you the best guidance I can to overcome and answer your dialogue woes. Let's get started. A portion of this video is sponsored by Pro Writing Aid. Oh, dialogue. For a lot of people, dialogue is like the Mount Everest of writing challenges. It's the big, daunting, looming obstacle between them and the story that they want to tell. And this makes sense because dialogue is such an intrinsic part of a story. It's a representation of your characters. It's how we move and manipulate conflict between characters, and it's how we progress the story. Dialogue does a lot of heavy lifting. If you're new to writing and dialogue seems like a big pain for you, watch last week's video on formatting your dialogue and how much dialogue you should have. You need to know that before you really start studying how to write dialogue. So let's start with Robert McKee and his book. The first thing to cover is that there are different kinds of dialogue. McKee starts his entire book discussing these types. He says that dialogue is sort of an overarching term for character talk. All dialogue must be personalized for your specific character and is an outward expression of inner action. Dialogue tells what the character thinks and feels in a much more human way than just reading internal narration like in a first-person story. There is always a reason that a character is talking. Always. No one ever just speaks without there being a reason behind it, even if that reason is just to be heard and make noise. The hard part for writers is that every single line of dialogue that you write must be representative of your characters. And that makes sense, right? I mean, your dialogue is representative of who speaks it. But it also needs to do a little bit more. Every line of dialogue is informed by desire, intent, and action. And that's the reason why a character speaks. That's still a little vague, so we'll get more into this later. Let's look at the three different kinds of dialogue. The first kind of dialogue is talking to others. That's, of course, the most popular kind of dialogue in writing. But then the second kind of talking is talking to oneself. And this is more common in things like plays and theater, where you can't easily explore like an inner dialogue unless it's said aloud. And third is breaking the fourth wall and talking to you, the audience. Now here's where McKee starts exploring concepts related to theater and movies and scripts and other media. Now this is a writing channel. I know all of that has to do with story, but I'm really going to pick out the parts of dialogue related to writing. However, I read it all, so any important takeaways within those other forms are still represented in this video, if they're important enough. For example, McKee further breaks down the dialogue into two more categories: dramatized and narratized dialogue. Dramatized dialogue is what we're most often used to seeing. He says that this is dialogue acted out. It's the dialogue between characters, it's an action, the words spoken, and the reaction and the effect of the words. While narratized dialogue isn't acted out, it's not something that's released to the outside world, but it's something communicated through first-person narration. This one's really interesting because I never considered this to be dialogue. McKee says that this style of dialogue is usually types 2 and 3. It's presented as the character speaking to themselves or speaking to the audience. It could be their internal narration where they question their decisions, or it could be an unreliable narrator where the narration tries to justify the terrible actions that they've done. Now, this is the strength of a first-person perspective. You get to create these moments of internal dialogue that only the character and the reader are privy to. McKee says that this narration as dialogue concept only works in the first person and not the third person, which also makes sense. You may have heard in the past about the literary term voice, right? And you may have wondered if that has something to do with dialogue. It doesn't. Voice is a combination of author's style, perspective, and personality in your writing. That voice does not serve the same purpose as dialogue. Don't get it twisted. Okay, these types of dialogue are interesting, I guess. Maybe it's good to know, but it doesn't yet inform us on how to write that dialogue or what that dialogue really does in a story. McKee begins this more actionable conversation on the 3 functions of dialogue: exposition, characterization, and action. Now, you may have heard that term exposition before. It's the details that the author needs the reader to know to fully involve that reader in the story. Let's take a quick sidebar here and let's talk about exposition. In the Discord, we have writers who share their stories for feedback. It's really awesome. And one of the most common bits of feedback that I give is in regards to exposition. And this is a rule that I want to present to you as well. It doesn't matter if you're writing epic fantasy or a space opera or a thriller set in Chicago, you will have some exposition. Look at me. Do not write your exposition in narration. Write your exposition in dialogue. Don't write Carson was a grizzled detective who was fed up with his new partner, the upbeat young rookie who didn't know enough about the streets. Instead, write a scene about the grizzled detective wanting to do something one way and the new partner saying that the police academy taught them to do it this other way. Exposition in narration does one single thing. It informs the reader about something. Exposition in dialogue informs the reader about something while also building your world and your characters and their relationships. If you find that you often have a lot of exposition in your stories, then I bet it's because you spend a lot of time planning your world and its various systems. The major pitfall of new writers, especially those coming from like tabletop RPGs and similar forms, is that you want to plan out every aspect of your world. And then when you go to start writing, you want to inform the reader of all these details that you planned out, even if the reader doesn't really need to know it. There's a video on this coming next month. Stop planning, start writing. Check it out. McKee agrees with this idea of exposition in dialogue. He calls it the first function of dialogue. It's that important. More so, he gives multiple tips regarding its use in exposition, and the first is pacing. In fact, his definition of pacing here is fantastic. It says, pacing is the rate or frequency with which exposition is spliced into the telling. Another struggle by new writers regarding exposition is thinking that the reader needs to know everything all at once, while that's not the case. Learning to pace your exposition is learning to only provide the details the reader needs to know right now. Luckily, this is a common element to tackle in editing your story, so you don't need to nail it in the first try. Something that McKee doesn't hit on here is the differences in genre when it comes to exposition. One of the great things that Brandon Sanderson is doing with his books, and this stems from Robert Jordan with The Wheel of Time, is to make the reader RAFO, read and find out, RAFO. Epic fantasy has long adopted this idea that not all questions need to be answered right away. And with the popularity of Sanderson's books, this concept is breaking into other genres as well. Readers are becoming more accepting that their questions may not be answered in this chapter, act, or even book. They will read and find out. Now, this requires the reader to trust the author. And that means if you break that trust, if you want the reader to read and find out, and then you fail in your delivery of that information, then you done messed up. Now readers won't trust that you will deliver on your promises. And that's a big issue for a writer. That can stop a reader from picking up your books. Following exposition, the next function of dialogue is characterization. Dialogue is one of the major ways that you can create unique characters. The section here on characterization is honestly quite short, surprisingly short. And I imagine McKee will spend more time talking about this in a section on writing dialogue, but in short, dialogue shows us how a character speaks, how they present themselves to others, and how others react to that character. And all of these combine into a unique image of the character. The final function of dialogue is action. And action can be mental, inciting a change in what a character thinks or knows. It can be physical, inciting an outward change, even as simple as a gesture or facial expression. And it could be verbal, the response and reply a line of dialogue generates. And also, one thing I'm noticing here is that McKee loves categories. I mean, my God, we're like 8 categories deep now. Let's talk about dialogue and how it relates to character. McKee calls this expressivity. My dude likes big words. And let's start with understanding that dialogue has different layers. When you're writing dialogue, you're usually thinking, my character would say this. And that's the most direct approach to dialogue, what a character says. But what authors often don't consider is what a character wouldn't say, the unsaid. This may be one of the quickest ways to amp up your dialogue. Consider what your character wouldn't say. This is usually the meaning underneath their words. It's unsaid, but the meaning is still there. The example given in the book is from The Devil Wears Prada. Emily Blunt's character says, "I'm just one stomach flu away from my goal weight." And that line, it carries humor, but there's also an unsaid message. This career is more important than my health. This is the idea of subtext. Even deeper than the unsaid is the unsayable. The secrets and fears and desires that a character might want, but can't bring themselves to admit. These hidden values could also be looked at as sort of like the character's motivations. Walter White from Breaking Bad craves power. He doesn't say that out loud, but it inspires every single thing that he says and does. There's a big section here that McKee goes over following this, and I have a hard time understanding its importance. A lot of it can kind of be summed up with more of the same information that we've already covered. Dialogue expresses character and must be informed by that character. He discusses how conflict requires dialogue and the differences between action-focused conflict and personal-focused conflict. He then talks about how dialogue can be used in different ways, ranging from figurative language to alliteration and pitch and volume of what's being said in the dialogue. He even goes as detailed as the 3 different kinds of dialogue line styles. This is how and why you should write a line of dialogue in a specific way, like with specific sentence structures. The suspense sentence stores the important information at the end of the sentence. For example, my friend brought something to the party, a painting. The core interest in that sentence is what the friend brought to the party, and it's revealed at the very end of the sentence. The cumulative sentence slowly adds more information as the dialogue continues, starting with the core idea and expanding on it. For example, the painting, it's white on white, 5 lines across the canvas that hardly stand out. Every bit of that sentence builds on itself into a larger, more encompassing meaning. And then you have the balanced sentence. Can you guess what that one does? It puts the core idea right in the middle of the sentence. And as with writing, with sentence length, kind of variety is the goal. Too much of one kind is a little bit stale. So with all of that being said, McKee gives us a few guiding principles to dialogue. He says, say as much as you can in as little as you can. So be concise and efficient and sparing with your dialogue to avoid rambling and tiptoeing around the point of your conversation. Don't be afraid to introduce a pause in dialogue or use silence as a tool. Sometimes actions speak louder than words. And if a dialogue doesn't seem to be landing in your story, think about how you can accomplish that goal through action. Then we get to part 2, and this is the part that I'm more excited to read through. This part of the book focuses on identifying and fixing your dialogue. And I want to stop here and tell you that this is in regards to editing your drafts. If you haven't written a proto-draft, then don't let your fear of writing dialogue stop you. You can tell here that editing is one step in tightening that dialogue. So as you practice writing, as you're finishing proto-drafts, as you're editing your work, that's when your dialogue really starts to improve. You need to get something down on paper to really understand where your successes and failures lie. You can't edit a blank page. McKee states that strong dialogue does 6 different things simultaneously, and I'll paraphrase them here. 1, each dialogue is inspired by action and purpose. 2, dialogue should help the scene build and progress. 3, exposition happens in dialogue. 4, characters act and sound unique. 5, dialogue should flow well. And 6, dialogue should fit within or enhance the story. Strong dialogue does some or all of these points, and if it doesn't, then you need to do something about it. There are 3 main ways that dialogue can fail. The first way that it can fail is due to credibility. And this is the name that McKee gives to dialogue and characters that aren't matching. A way to write realistic dialogue that I've always been told is to go to a cafe or airport or subway or anywhere public and eavesdrop on the conversations around you. Listen to how these people talk. But I don't know if you've noticed this. When people talk in real life, it's full of like boring, meaningless drivel. McKee makes a distinction between conversation and dialogue. Dialogue has meaningful content, while conversation is more of a pastime. Here are some other reasons that dialogue can fail. Empty dialogue is when the reader is unable to understand the reason that a character is talking. This is when you read a conversation in your book and finish the scene thinking, that was a waste of time, or what was the point of that? The content of the conversation doesn't seem to be connected with the character's motivations. A common failure here is when the author introduces exposition and dialogue, that's good, but it feels out of place, that's bad, or it just feels like it was written to explain exposition, that's even worse. We've all done it. Another common example of failed dialogue is just overdoing it, which can happen in a few ways. Not overdoing the amount, but a character being overly emotional in a way that doesn't connect with the reader's understanding of that character's emotions. Does that make sense? A character knowing more about the world or characters or plot than they should, and that's typically an outcome of exposition or poor planning. A character who sees the other characters at a deeper level than they should, maybe they hint at the character's unsayable fears or desires. How should they know that, you know? All of these failures happen when the author struggles to really understand the character. But good news, a lot of this can be caught in editing. Thankfully, this portion of the video is sponsored by Pro Writing Aid. Pro Writing Aid is a tool for writers by writers. I picked up a lifetime membership of Pro Writing Aid almost 4 years ago because it natively integrates with my favorite writing tool of choice, Scrivener. I'm able to take my manuscript and open it up in the Pro Writing Aid desktop app. I can make my edits, save the document, and I'm done. It's made editing so much easier, and if you've been in the pits of your novel doing line edits, then you know how tough and demoralizing it can be. Pro Writing Aid offers all kinds of reports ranging from spelling, to style, to grammar, to entire story critiques that will provide feedback on all aspects of your story, like your characters and your pacing. And you can change the writing genre too, so if you're writing fantasy, nonfiction, I don't know, or even like a work memo, it can give you different kinds of editing tips. There are multiple ways to use Pro Writing Aid, from an extension in your internet browser to the Desktop Everywhere app. And these tools mean that Pro Writing Aid can integrate with any place that you can enter text, giving you the tools and guidance that you need to be a great writer no matter where you write. Use the code WritingTheory10 at checkout to get 10% off. Another way that you can fail in your dialogue is based on the language that you use. McKee suggests avoiding the cliches as best as you can and write original stuff. Duh. And then here's something interesting that I actually disagree with. McKee says you should never settle for the obvious choice when it comes to dialogue. Now, I don't really think that's bad advice, but I also think that it's worded wrong. When I write, and maybe when you write, I find myself being sucked into the story. I'm not writing and being inventive, I'm sort of just transcribing the scenes that are playing in my head. There becomes this connection between my brain and the keyboard, and the words just flow. When you're in the midst of writing and you're in this state where you're just connected with your characters, you absolutely should write the first thing that comes to mind. In that kind of state, you are as close to the characters as you can be. If you were to stop at every line of dialogue and consider what your second option of dialogue would be, then I think you would pull away from your characters and sort of lose touch. The rest of the advice that McKee gives here is kind of middling. Don't try to be an author that uses absurdly fancy dialogue. Specifically, don't write the kind of dialogue that after writing, you lean back in your chair and think about how clever you are. This includes things like verbose language, purple prose, and philosophical lines that don't really match the characters or the story. Now, of course, you can choose to write a character that speaks like that. By all means, do. Basically, everything you're going to hear in this next section appended with unless your character intentionally talks like that. Just like how you should avoid ostentatious language, you should avoid language that's too dry. You should be concrete, not abstract. You should be familiar, not exotic. Use short words, not long words. Be direct with your dialogue. Be active, not passive. Prefer short speeches, not long speeches. More on this later. And of course, with all of that, I'm sure someone will say that you need to have balance. I hate when people say that. Yes, of course, it would be nice if everything you did was with the perfect amount of every ingredient.
Yes, sir.
His last point here is to eliminate clutter. And this is a really good point for new writers. When trying to write realistic dialogue, new writers may include this kind of small talk. It's what happens in the real world, but it's not what happens in books. Don't waste your reader's time with a fill-in-the-blank greeting between characters. How you doing? I'm doing good. How are you? McKee then ends the chapter with this. If your dialogue does not suggest unsaid thoughts and feelings below the surface, either enrich it or cut it. What a great line. Cut it out. You know what I'm saying? We've talked about credibility flaws, language flaws. Now we can talk about something called content flaws. We can kind of boil this down to two main lessons. The first being, don't write your dialogue too on the nose. And this is another common issue with new writers and their dialogue. The characters are saying exactly what they feel or exactly what they're doing or what they're going to do. It's the same issue as show don't tell. The reader shouldn't hear the character say, "I'm nervous to ask you out." We should see this character struggle with their words and dance around the topic if they're truly nervous. The second issue in content flaws is something called the monologue fallacy. And this is the idea that dialogue is action and reaction. And when your character speaks for a long time in a monologue, there's a limit to how long it can go on before readers feel awkward. Here's why. So when you're presenting a monologue, some long passage of speaking, there's no room for response from others. And that leads to your character talking and kind of the world stopping around them. And that can be for an uncomfortable amount of time for someone to be speaking with no reaction. And this is why McKee recommends shorter and more broken up dialogue when you're attempting something akin to a monologue. And then McKee includes a bit here on what he calls design flaws, and this is kind of a more meta approach to dialogue. This includes things like repetition, and repetition can mean a few different things here, but the biggest takeaway is the idea of repetitious beats. So not repeating the same word time and time again, but repeating the same meanings and outcomes. The idea of a scene where a friend invites the character out, and the character says, "Leave me alone," but that friend doesn't give up. They go back and forth over and over again, invitation and rejection, invitation, rejection. The words may be different, but nothing really changes. You achieved your purpose in that dialogue in that first interaction. The book then ends with 8 detailed case studies that take popular media, plays, books, and movies and analyze their dialogue and the scenes and each beat. And I was actually surprised at how much of the analysis of these scenes related to what we learned in the story grid by Sean Coyne. McKee breaks down each of these scenes in a similar way, looking at sort of the overall change that each story beat has on the scene as a whole. And then finally, McKee ends with just some words of encouragement. He says just how plot is rooted in human story, dialogue is rooted in the human experience. You can always rely on your own judgment when it comes to your characters because you're human too. I don't know you. The more that you read, the more that you watch movies, the more that you talk to people, the better understanding that you have of how dialogue should work. You start to figure out the natural cadence and the cues and the interruptions and the hesitations that people use. The more you absorb, the better equipped you are to write. Study your favorite books, read with intention, and practice. If you like videos like this, breaking down stories, trying to understand the intricacies of writing, then like this video and subscribe. Come hang out in the Discord, join in on some writing challenges with us. We'll give you an excuse to write. I hope to see you there, and as always, thank you for watching.